In this next talk, we have a fantastic talk by Ron Brash. So Ron's currently the director of cybersecurity insights over at Verve, but he's been around for a while. And before that, I think he's had some skill sets that are extraordinarily relevant to this talk as well. I remember his work over at Tofino back in the day, and Tofino being kind of a company and a product well ahead of its time with ICS application aware kind of firewalls or gateways and firewalls. Another wonderful speaker that will be coming up later, Eric Byers, obviously from Tofino. The reality, though, is Ron's got a very unique point of view as it comes to kind of embedded device and embedded device security and software development and really what goes into it. Had gone, from there to another tech company, then to Deloitte, working across a number of industrial sites, helping them to get their understanding of security together before going over to Verve. So with his insights, he did a presentation at the Oil and Gas Summit. If you missed it, it is on YouTube. But at the Oil and Gas Summit at SANS, he did this Tale of Two Wireless RTUs, and it was a really well-received presentation. And so when he pitched the idea of doing another spin on it, kind of a part two at a technical level, it was an obvious yes, especially with how well it was received last time. So to get kind of the extension of that and be able to get into some topics that are really relevant lately, ranging from like ransomware and the things that many of you are dealing with, to a sort of a light touching on things like SBOM or software bill of materials, which is not only extraordinarily relevant from a supply chain perspective, but just anytime you want to do vulnerability management or an understanding of, hey, what's actually in the box. You don't have to be Brad Pitt to ask that question. So without further ado, Ron, please take it away. And again, thank you so much for joining us today at the SANS Summit.
Thanks, Rob. That's a great introduction. I believe I have control of the screen. I do, so let's get cracking. Is it not? There we go. All right. So I always try to make my presentations really fun. And the oil and gas one, I didn't do this, but in my presentation, there's a number of robots hidden in it. There is no prize, but you're happy to go for it. And we might actually wind up with an interesting concept of it. So I had some surprises in this. I actually put the ransom wing of all this as a proof of concept together in the last month and a half. So this was a real tight deadline to get the slide decks in and get through the disclosures. So I called it the tale of some ships, a compromise, and the sinking. And when we think about embedding ransomware and what could go wrong, or Linux malware, this starts to really go down a different path than what I expected it to go down. So just to level set, if you took the ICS certs, kind of Rob did a breakdown of that earlier, but there's 50% of them are roughly embedded related. Now, when you think of the complexities in dealing with failed hardware, in most cases for commodity PLCs and cards, you're looking at over a week if you don't have equipment on hand. But when you get to the bigger stuff, the DCSs, you get towards turbine control, we're talking about weeks. We're talking about big transformers. You're going back in the periods of months to get a replacement because they're all custom order. But when you look at the overall advisories, there's zero. They're actually discussing the actual quality of the products. And when you look at the overall amount of vulnerabilities out there, it's mostly the top tier vendors that are reporting issues, and the top, second, and third tiers and onwards are basically having a free lunch and they're wide open for anybody else. So I guess it's a really relevant supply chain discussion, but also from a risk matrix perspective. The assets that are not from first-tier vendors, you probably are your highest risk assets in terms of resiliency to cybersecurity. Now, is there a risk to this and embedded? I think there is, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But when you look at the overall embedded assets, for example, if you had 100 Windows boxes, well, I can guarantee you that you probably have 3 to 5 times more of those in the embedded side. So just to give you an idea why I think this is a unique approach to going after embedded assets. So I like to use analogies. So I'm calling this the sea of convenience and your ships that sink in it. And generally, why I call it the sea of convenience is if you look at the triangle of cost, security, and convenience, they're very related. But ego tends to be one of the main driving factors in there. So when we're building products, we should be doing engineering better, but we're not. And so if we look at that ship, I think it's a pirate ship probably in Puerto Vallarta or Cancun, something along those lines. There's all these pieces in there, and how do they overlap and how do they tie things together? Well, it turns out almost all those components are used in your home router. They are used in a majority of connectivity-related industrial devices. So that would be OT gateways, networking appliances, less so on the PLC side and the DCS side. They're more of a real-time operating system and generally use FPGAs and microcontrollers. But the commodity systems is really what this talk is about. But I really want to be honest here. Secure embedded development is really hard. It's not taught in school. So there's a big gap there from the electrical engineering side and the computer science side. But criminals and pirates are opportunistic. So if I see on Shodan 1,500 of one of the RTUs that I'm looking at, I know that that number is probably closer to 100,000, just that we're not seeing them on Shodan. But the reason being is that embedded devices, and particularly these that they're providing connectivity like gateways, they have easy global access generally. They have nice squishy soft centers. Think of it as like your favorite candy. They often have custom management interfaces and implementations, and they have usually high replacement costs because they're in the middle of nowhere. So that's part of it. Or they go back a long time. So I thought to myself, why not show a proof of concept after all? Because it always seems to be a series of failures that lead to people going under. So where have we seen it? Well, some people might say we haven't seen it. Well, we've seen Linux embedded malware for somewhat closer to the last decade, if not more. But particularly, we've seen it recently where people have been targeting network area storage devices that are storing all your backups, which would make sense, right? Go after the backups and you'll pay my ransom. So it's been on consumer routers, QNAPs, NetGear, and then we've also seen a few cases where we buy devices off of eBay or the gray market, and they have Bitcoin miners on them. So I think that's a very interesting MITRE attack vector or IOC that's missing out of there, using devices off the gray market to infect people behind the lines. But we have seen these type of things. So if I were an attacker, and I'm putting on my evil hat here, there's kind of three games you'd want to play, right? There's always the stick 'em up kind of game, right? The racketeering game. And I'm going to focus on, I can cause as much damage at once, overwhelm you, so you're probably going to pay me, right? So thinking for ubiquitous, but enabling devices like network infrastructure. And then you have ones that are maybe not so ubiquitous, but they're highly inconvenient. I got to go send someone out to a job site. They're 3 hours away from town, work orders, schedules get interrupted, stuff like that. Like, for example, wind farms might be a prime example of that, or a micro dam in the bushes, or some wellheads. So that cost gets factored in there. It's not the cost of the device that's the ransom. It's the end-to-end remediation of that asset, and then you times that by end devices. And if I really wanted to be selective, of course, there's some of those low frequency but high impact events. I would go after the embedded systems. Now, in that case, I borrowed an image there, but one of my devices did light on fire, but it was from eBay and used. It was the voltage converter. So I kind of had to make do for the moment. So I like to always start with a technique and process. And this is how I like to think. I like to think structure. So what I did was I went on eBay and looked for a bunch of commodity devices, and I cross-referenced that with Shodan and some other open source intelligence gathering tools. I looked for cheap because when you start playing with hardware and playing with things like bricking, you can really easily make a mistake. And so there was an interesting concept back ago, or being talked about earlier, which was attackers need to get things right. And when you're dealing with bricking firmware, or you're playing with getting control of sections of memory or flash when you shouldn't be, things go wrong very quickly. But so I tried to look at all these different things and look for systems that were ubiquitous but had poor designs. And I also factored in my time, of course, here. Interestingly enough, we had a customer with a bunch of these assets, and I use that as kind of a guiding factor. What would be the risks for them? What would they care about? Why would someone target them? Would it just be a drive-by shooting kind of ransomware? Well, it turns out when you start looking at the assets that they have, I need to get a bigger picture of risk. And so one of the ways to do so is using a software bill of materials. Now, Eric Byers and I think some of the other people are going to talk about that more in depth. My objective is not to talk about SBOMs or the benefits of it, but I do realize that I use it to inform my approach on when I'm trying to reverse engineer equipment to see what's inside. Presence of a vulnerability, though, does not equate to exploitability, to be fair. But it gives me an idea of the interfaces, components, already known tools, and it gives me what I call a rough attack itinerary. So then I take that itinerary and I analyze and conceptualize it all into kind of 2 or 3 strategies, an A, B, and C. And I look for the feasible entry points and what would someone else do? So and then I try to stitch all that together, and I will probably do like a manual walkthrough, right? It might involve copy and pasting, running some scripts, or something along those lines. And then I'll develop a weaponized prototype, go about my disclosure of all of that, and then I'll probably wind up here talking about it or regretting the fact that I did. But nonetheless, I like to be edgy. So I kind of put everything together here for this one particular RTU. I did blur out who it is. Some of you may or may not be able to guess who it is, but I don't wish to disclose that to them, to the general public, because a lot of vendors, even some of the top tiers, are guilty of this, and they have devices in the field. But what I do is I start wide. I think of it like a pit mine. And I go around circle and circle, and as I get deeper, or I need to follow the vein, I'll get more precise as I go. So I start with some samples. I look at firmware, and guess what? In both of these cases for these devices, the firmware is online, freely downloadable. There's not even an account credential to go grab it. So building firmware is no problem if there's no signing and no encryption. So I didn't even bother with that. We ripped those devices apart. And then I look for things like open source license notices, because that tells me a lot. And then I also used a hardware probe to find out a few other things about that device, like what if there's pauses on the bootloaders and stuff like that. But I use all this information together to get a good idea of what my targets would look like. Now, one of my targets, guess what? It had an x86 version. So I plopped that into VMware Workstation, and then I hammered on it. And then when I broke it, I would just reverse it and go back at it. So that was really nice for once. The Raspberry Pi version of that device actually, unfortunately, used a file system that doesn't work with QNAP. So that was a bit of a problem, and then I had to go find more tools to unload it. So there were some problems there. But when we loaded one of those firmwares for one of the RTUs in general, this is where I used the Adolis FACT platform to do a lot of my heavy lifting for me. And there's some other integrations here. This one in particular is through one of Adolis's third-party integrations, and it tells me where all the buffer overflows are. It spat out a big list of vulnerabilities and all the components. Now, again, the presence of a vulnerability does not mean exploitability, and I'll talk about that a bit more. But I use all that to kind of get everything together and to aid me as a human being, because I was on a really, really tight time schedule here to get this going. And then I also looked at the breakdowns to see where other common components are in the product. In this case, I was looking for things like BusyBox, Bash. Does BusyBox have Telnet in it? Because I don't have to install Netcat, or I can live off the land. And if I know that there's Bash versus Ash, then what I can do is I can tailor my scripts. So my Bash script that I write on my x86 Ubuntu laptop won't break on the embedded device that's running a much smaller subset of Bash and has some slightly different syntactical problems. So I put all that together, and it turns out one of the boards in particular, actually both of them, are based off of a reference design from Atmel. I have a lot of experience with this particular chip, which was an extra bonus on it. So I just carried along with it, and off I went. So on the low-cost device, everyone, and I'm going to focus on RTUs, but the low-cost IoT or Internet of Trash type devices are really just the PLC of yesteryear. And this particular device, it was reasonably well done for a smaller, I wouldn't even say it's a third-tier organization. I've seen it elsewhere being used for low-cost overhead displays for discrete manufacturing. But the management plane was something I went after. And when I also got into the device, I eventually realized that, guess what? It had lots of other treats inside of it. And so you have to be very, very careful when you're playing with these, because you can't load big files. They also sometimes, if they do read-only file systems, then you have to deal with the overlays. Now, thankfully, OpenWRT's overlay or whiteout OS is now a commodity, and guess what? Now you can do pivots on the file system and block stuff that shouldn't be. So you can actually if you know where the mount point happens, you can get in front of it and tear it down and lock the device out altogether, even if you don't have access to the read-only firmware. So there's some really cool cheats there that I got to play with on this. But I went after the side channels, because guess what? That's probably how I'm going to get in. Your third-party software, maybe not your first tier or your first-party software, but I'm going to go after your other aspects. So I am terrible at pirate accents, and obscurity by obscurity, A-matey. I would have said A-buddy as a kind of a Canadian sense, but what I did was I loaded it up quickly, their management tool on Ghidra. I looked for a few things. I noticed they scrubbed the symbol tables. Okay, fine, I don't care. But they made some critical mistakes. One was they hard-coded in their RSA private key. The second mistake they made was they linked to an external shared object, which is a Qt5 component. When I recompiled Qt5 with all the debug symbols, I started stepping through it, and I found out that their server implementation, so they issue a knock, I'll talk a little more about that, they issue a knock packet, they connect back, and their TCP server, which is a TLS variant on the Qt5 sockets, was line for line, the reference code used elsewhere and also on various forums. So in a hurry, I knew exactly where to set all my breakpoints. I could dump out keys. I could dump out what was going through the pipe. And even though the variant of the TLS where you can't, I don't know P and Q, but even though I know my keys, I couldn't get a hold of that. Well, guess what? I was dumping out everything before the program got it. So that was a bit of fun. So what I did in this case, this device, I went after the management interface as my controlling mechanism for ransomware. I was using that as the delivery vehicle. It issues a broadcast out. These devices are typically 50 at once. On site, there's probably nobody that would even be able to deal with these. So it'd be a localized problem, localized ransomware if it were. And so if you're in a high volume but low profit margin, kind of environment, this is going to be the first thing that you probably go for, just to make life a hell is one of the many things you would do to get a ransom out of them. And so what I did was I would enumerate all the devices. I would push my payload to the device. And I had a choice there of bricking it or unlocking the device. Now, this case, it's an SD cards, so it's not a big deal. So I kind of kept this one nice and trim. This is the icing on the cake. So in this case, all your signage belongs to me. I realized that the knock packets had no HMACs. So you could just replay them, and I replay them in a way that I was in the controlling workstation. The devices that were not compromised yet would respond back to me with all of the legitimate keys. They thought I was okay. Then what I did was I realized that their application was doing sanitization on the fields. So instead of me writing my own utility from scratch, I actually just started replacing the strings in their program with my own, and I managed to get the device to ping outwards to a position that I was happy with. So you can do some really cool stuff without having to be really crazy. Now, all I would have done in this case was to nuke the MTD partition with the command, game over. Someone would have to go flash these devices. So this one was a simple example, but a little more on the reverse engineering side. Now, the two ICS RTUs or gateways, whatever you want to call them. They use an Atmel 91 older chip. It's an interesting crossover between the modern ARM CPU and an MCU. It actually has memory matrices. It does a lot of I/O. It's cheap. It's ubiquitous. You can mount it on a SODIMM, which is generally how you see it, versus a soldered on SoC. It's reused everywhere, and interestingly enough, it's always the same board support packages. Yes, the I/O pins might change some of the addresses, but 95% of the code in every instance is the same. And that means also the kernel configs are also the same in most cases. In this case, the devices by default don't have SSH or HP enabled, but when you put yourself into the asset owner's shoes for right or wrong, there's that convenience ego iceberg that starts to appear. A lot of people don't like using a particular vendor's OEM management tools. They want to go have SSH on it. They will put them on the internet out of convenience sakes. Many of these will show up as a particular cellular LTE's IP address. And maybe even if you do some port magic and mapping with NAT routers, you also find them. But what was interesting on this is that these devices are everywhere. And often if you know who owns it, and you know what the site's name is, you can probably guess the password because they're formulaic. Yes, they would be unique and they would be hard to brute force if you didn't know anything, but if you're able to add 2 + 2 and maybe another unknown number, you can probably figure out what it is in a hurry. So I do worry about that. Now, the bigger problem though is that when I compared the two firmwares together with software bill of materials, they're almost the same, except for the Linux kernel, but I think that was just due to an updated reference design. In the older device, which only is recently end-of-lifed, it's running a Linux kernel from 2012, which has something like 700 known vulnerabilities. Now, again, they're not all necessarily there, but then the newer one had something like 130 vulnerabilities in it. So there's still some really good ideas there to play with. But once you're into these devices, people think, oh, well, I just get into it. I can do whatever. Well, actually, there's a lot more I could do inside of it. One of the things you can do is go after layer 0 devices that are attached to many of these devices. So most of the time, these are TCP to serial gateways in some way, shape, or form. So I could sniff the TTYs and find out, hey, guess what? You have a relay behind there. Well, I'll just turn it off. You can do things like, hey, guess what? Someone's got their SMS credentials on here. I can start spamming you with issues. I can start using your email accounts and spamming you with emails as well for when those systems are supposed to go down or they have a critical event. Anything I wanted to do with these devices, I could, and ransomware is one of the things I could do. So inside this device, I started looking for things I know. I put on my pirate cap and I said, what can I pillage? Well, one of the first things you do is you dump out the partition table. It turns out that, yes, there was some read-only stuff in here, but there's a common design pattern that everybody uses for the most part that is starting to foray into embedded Linux. And they use U-boot environment partitions as the way of controlling their devices, applying license keys, and you can also do other stuff inside of that as well, like alter the boot sequence, open up serial ports to get into the bootloader. Then you could load your own bootloader into it. You can do all sorts of magic inside there. But if you can get access to any of those, especially the primary ones, well, you could just write zeros to it with DD, or even copy it off of the device, put your copy back, modified copy back in. That's what I started looking for. Then I look for secrets. Well, guess what? Old kernel, a busy box. Ooh, busy box. Okay, well, what's inside of there? Well, I don't even need to bring my own tools on the device, and I don't even need to bring my own firmware to the party. So I realized, what could I start to do here? Well, okay. And then what I realized was, wow, I don't even need to encrypt firmware because nobody's going to be able to get back into this afterwards, and probably nobody's going to unsolder a surface flow chip anyways. Well, I just got to nuke the boot line out of this, just the boot command or some of the other parameters, and presto, it's over. So, okay, I have a pretty good idea of how to destroy it. So what I did was I thought about ransoming from one of two places. One is this particular device or these devices call home to a management server. 9 times out of 10, that management server is inside of an IT corporate zone, and it talks outbound to the field, or it's in some sort of weird DMZ and probably not, and very well, in most cases, not well protected. So I can go that way, and I can talk directly to the device and enable functionality or issue my commands, whatever I wish. Or I can go through that formulaic password n times n, where I see 1,000 devices aligned, I know some variation of passwords, and I go at it. That's my option too. Now, in this case, that's what I did. I went after that just for the purposes of time here. You'd find your credentials, you'd get into it. I dropped a small script onto the device saying, okay, well, I want you to call home, and then I want you to go from there. So that's what I did across the strategy. This is my strategy for the RTUs. So in this case, what I did was I bashed the unsyncable into the sunk. There's a configuration file on there if I had chosen to get the SMS and get the emails to send ransomware to an afflicted organization. Maybe they'd be reading those emails. Maybe there'd be someone on the receiving end of the text messages. In most organizations, it goes into something like ServiceNow. So you're going to have a really bad day when you start seeing my emails. I dropped on a very, very simple dropper script, all written in Bash. And what I did, I like to be really fun on these type of stuff. So I took a PNG image and I uploaded to Image Shack, which I think is really the only legitimate reason that anyone should ever be using Image Shack, is to use it as a payload dropping control center. And so my script goes out there, and this is without any additional tools. I didn't even use DD. You can use, you just have to be a bit careful with some of the tools, like head doesn't like binary data, so you gotta watch what you're doing. And so I put in there what my command address would be. It's just a very simple command and length field. And that device then calls home to me, it registers itself. So in that case, we had it registered here. I did block out some of the information. And guess what? It told me I was root. Okay, well, game over at this point. So I select my target. I could select multiple targets with my very, very simple CNC server. So I issue it the first command, which is a lock banners and ready the bricking. So I lock them out. I turn off SSH. I turn off all the management ports and protocols, except for the web server one. I rename and destroy all of the CGIs that should allow you into the box, and I make you pay me your Bitcoin. If you don't do that, then I will just turn around and issue a walk the plank, which would give you something like 30 seconds, change the boot string in the U-boot. Once the device reboots, in any case, it's over. And so that's all I did. That's all you have to do to ransomware almost every single embedded Linux product out there. Even if with custom shells, chances are it's inside of a CH root, and you can go from there. You can do all sorts of things to crash devices, like load malformed kernel modules, mount stuff you shouldn't be doing. You could bit bang on SPI buses or UARTs. You could probably get the device to misbehave in any way, shape, or form. And there's a few things on that I'd like to talk about. So when we are thinking about products, and Andy Bachman really teed this up well, and David Foos is coming after me from Emerson, we really got to start about engineering products well. And I know that this sounds like common sense, but if it was common, we'd all be doing it. So yesterday, we saw and we know that all of these industrial control system devices have copious issues in them because they were maybe designed for a time without security. Right or wrong, I'm not there for that historic lesson, but we need to protect them because of what they do for our society. Lights on, water flowing, regardless of where you are in the world. We needed corrective actions on that, and we need to help the vendors and the asset owners. We needed to have guidelines. Well, we do have some great guidelines today, and we're going down the path of secure development and maintenance, but we still need more SDLC. Then we transition to today. Industrial, Internet of Things, gateway devices, we keep seeing them. And that's why I kind of made a comment earlier about the layered model being dead. It is kind of dead because many of these devices transcend those logical layers from a security architecture perspective. Thanks, Rob, for that one. But they do kind of break things out differently. Or, for example, you might find that because of the ubiquity of hardware nowadays and their speed, you can get close to real-time resolution on I/O pins without having to run a very special FPGA or running an MCU with dedicated components. So there's a lot of things you can do now, and as a result of that, you're getting more and more products that are fully capable. The problem is that security is not on any of their roadmaps. It is not being taught in school. Software developers think it's not their problem. And so we're winding up in a situation where the OT devices of yesterday are actually the same as the IoT devices of today. They're just far more in number and openly accessible. So we need to manage the risks by these new exposed novo legacy assets, as they like to call them. And we need to start improving the product development. And this isn't just for RTUs, although in that case of the RTU that I showed, that was from the latest firmware from that manufacturer from roughly 6 months ago, and it's still the same one that's posted online on their website today. So tomorrow we need to prepare on how do we deal with replacement of hardware. I'm not trying to sing a warning song and say the sky is falling. I'm just saying we need to maybe think about some of this ahead of time and how we will deal with it, or do we have a plan B? So maybe don't rely on one particular vendor, but maybe look at more than one. Think of technology diversity, if you will, at least for the outer layers that will probably change more frequently updated, like the gateways. Maybe not your relay that's serially connected, but the gateway itself. And we look at things and we try to maintain them and consider them from past their end of life and so on. So I want to talk more about that, and I wanted to add a very interesting flavor to all of this. Now, I recognize I'm coming up on time, so my 6 takeaways for all of this are: we need to do secure software development better. Period. Start doing it. Teach it in school. Throw figurative rocks at people until they get it. Tofino, we used to use a toilet paper roll for us that were participating in this when we made mistakes. Vendors and asset owners need to start enforcing this. Long are the days where you can get away with this and say, oops, there was just a bug. Most bugs are and do have security considerations, especially when we're talking about safety, reliability, and productivity. We need legislation and certifications. I don't know the sheer benefits. Some people say they won't, some will. It's a religious debate, but they will help, I think, in at least starting us going down the right path. We need to protect those management interfaces. I know everyone thinks of crown jewels as your turbine control or stuff like that, but it's much more than that. It's the other stuff that helps you get in. And particularly in these cases, it might be very inconvenient if you don't have access to something like oil and gas was like 400,000 wellheads. Good luck replacing all of those devices. There's no money to be found in replacing hardware. Be prepared and be stocked up. Have a few extra devices on hand. Very rarely do I ever see this. I understand it's a cost, but it's something you need to consider, at least from an electronic maintenance perspective. Limit your over-provisioning. So if you're a vendor, stop shipping out devices with extra widgets inside of them. I know it helps for diagnostics. I know it helps for tech support, but stop doing it. You're helping people like me and writing code that almost anybody, including intermediate or novice with a little bit of system engineering, could figure out. If the file system has everything, I don't need to bring my own tooling to the party. I just need to write a few scripts. In this case, Telnet is literally the netcat. And then my last point, I'm kind of going to switch right back to the $sign. Sufficient motivation does exist. If you have 1,000 of these RTUs or LTE gateways out in the field, and they're all using a derivative of the same password, I don't have to be a quick thinker to know that you're probably going to pay me if I can find the right balance, because I know how long it's going to take you to deal with all those. So that's my key takeaways. I'm not trying to sound like a warbringer, but there's a lot of challenges here. And I'll just end this up here. Thank you. And I'm really sorry for unleashing this to show you how easy it is to do.
Great. Thanks, Ron. Fantastic follow-up to your previous talk as well. And, I think we always try to balance that. We say, hey, look, we don't want to hype things out. We don't want to scare people. At the same time, look at these massive issues. Doesn't mean people are going to immediately die, but holy crap, you got to solve this because there are real issues and real impact to it. So no, I think you threaded that needle very, very well. So our first question over in chat, we got just a couple minutes to answer questions, then we can get to the next talk. And the first one was around just like better understanding of what are the first steps to integrated security in the CI/CD process as we start thinking about, better software development and OT.
Ooh, good question. I think there's multiple perspectives here, and some of it starts at the interview of those developers before you even start writing code. You need to have a culture of security. There is tools that can integrate in that scan your code and can generate alarms, and you need to have persons that are responsible to it. And then there's other pieces you could do. You could do like firmware analysis of all the artifacts before you package up the firmware, and then packaging the firmware and then doing analysis on it again. And then there's also the extra step, which in most cases, most vendors fail at unless they're maybe top tier, is encrypting firmware and signing it and making sure the interfaces to load that firmware in the device are secure in another place. So there's many places here overall. I don't know which one to start with in particular, but security is not just about maturity, and maturity does not equate to security as well. So there's a few misconceptions that everyone needs to deal with, and tools and common sense and engineering are all part of the solution.
Yeah, fantastic. So we have one here, and I've seen tons of mention of Rust. I know Adam Crane has been talking about it a lot. I know the Amazon team has bitched it out a bunch. But any thoughts on Rust for the embedded space?
I knew that question was going to come up. I like Rust. I think it does have a bit of a learning curve. I think there's a bit of work to be done to get it to, maybe to be ubiquitous as C is. I think Rust will come and it will have its heyday. Now, I hope it doesn't turn into basically the Ada Pro Ada Pro that was used for airlines and stuff in the 1980s and 90s. I hope it doesn't become that. There'll be a lot of issues with making compilable code, deterministic code, but a lot of that can be kind of dealt with over time as long as these devices support it. But also, I think the big push will come from the vendors or the integrators that build these board support packages that have the build routes. If they start including Rust, that means that we will start using Rust in our products, which means hopefully we'll get the other advantages out of Rust de facto by inheritance.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, it's always when I see Rust, I mean, we use Rust. Everybody's using Rust to some degree, but it's always when I see these things, everyone wants to throw them out like, oh, we'll be done with the issues if we just do this thing. Like now there's so many interconnected topics here, but it is a good programming language for sure. And then probably one last for one more. Actually, I'll do the question right here about the vendor side. You mentioned legislation, you mentioned kind of demanding of your vendors, but what do you think the best way is to incentivize the vendors, and maybe just legislation? But what's your thoughts there?
Well, as you said, it's a tangled web of perspectives. Interestingly enough, one of the things we did recently for another customer, and in particular it was on that Raspberry overhead display, is I did an analysis before they bought the product. So as you're thinking of doing secure technology transitions or moving to, I don't know, technology X.0, whatever buzzword comes out tomorrow, do a very thorough investment in time ahead and do an analysis of that product that you're going to be buying and you're going to be supporting for the next 20 years. You don't build a house on shaky foundations or on terrible ground. So why would you buy a product that is very haphazard and jury-rigged? You shouldn't. So what we did for that one customer was we did a very small but reasonable in-depth analysis, and I looked to see if it stunk. And I built an SBOM out of it. I poked at the device. I enumerated, several risks, some a little more detailed than others. And I went to the CISO and said, this is what you're going to be buying into, and this is what you're going to have to inherit. I recommend you don't do it. And I think you should maybe go somewhere else or use that as a stick to go hit your vendor with and get something better. The other thing to do is to stay away from designs that are non-vanilla. That will also help your case, because if you go with non-vanilla open source code, you wind up being on what's on a branch, and it will never get all the mainline features, and you won't be getting the update path. So sometimes being custom and one-off isn't the right way to go about it. You want to be mainline, and that will also help you too. But we did use SBOMs as a way to say no. And then we also did some suggestions for the CISO, and I think it was well received. And I even used I was suggesting SBOMs to the customer that had 1,000 of these assets and saying, before you buy more, let's think about this and maybe go see what else is out there.
Yeah, no, fantastic. I think I hear a lot of the discussions in Congress these days about this topic, because I think the appetite from a national security perspective, to hope that asset owners are bringing in people to do assessments to find the issues, I think that is waning, and I would not be surprised to see some SBOM and kind of base level security regulations. Now, how and what is always the challenge. But I think we're probably going to see something more along that lines over the next year than not. Anyways, Ron, fantastic presentation. Thanks for participating. And thank you so much. Over in hallway-ron-brash is where he'll take all the different questions and comments. Got a lot of kudos and love waiting for you there, Ron. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Rob. Take care.